Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. The rising heavyweight Joyce has again called out Alexander Povetkin, wanting to face the Russian, but this time he wants the vacant EBU title to be on the line. So there's two parts to this sort of video: the dropping of the EBU title by Agit Kabayel, and then on to the potential what next for the EBU title, which Joyce was the challenger. He was the mandatory to Kabayel, but obviously now he will have to fight someone else. So I'll start with the EBU title first. So Kabayel had obviously been the holder, had been for some time. He'd made a number of defences. Joyce was his mandatory challenger, and it was meant to go to a purse bid, but he's withdrawn, and because of that, he's actually dropped the belt, and that is confirmed on the EBU website. You can see here on screen under the heavyweight section, it is now listed as a vacant title, where previously Kabayel was obviously listed as the holder. Challenger is listed as Joyce, so obviously he's going to get a chance to fight for that belt. So why would Kabayel drop the title? Well, we can only speculate on that. I guess some will say that he didn't want any business or any parts of Joyce. You could also make an argument that he could go in another direction. He didn't necessarily need to continue holding that title to make waves in the heavyweight division. In his own right, he is a very good heavyweight, and he obviously has the Derek Chisora on his resume. That is the best win of his career. He's got some options, especially if he wants to now go overseas instead of campaigning in Europe. But we'll put that to one side because on Kabayel's social media, no updates, no real explanation. So we'll just move on to a couple of other things now. So this here is from Frank Warren's official Instagram account. It repeats: Agit Kabayel vacates European Championship, with a quote here: "We can confirm that Agit Kabayel has withdrawn from today's purse bid with Joyce and therefore vacated his European Heavyweight Championship." So that does confirm the EBU website. But also you have Joyce's manager, and this is where we get to the crux of the next piece with Alexander Povetkin and even possibly Carlos Takam. So Sam Jones says, "I've got no problems with the fighter doing what's best for them, but Kabayel assured me personally he'd fight Joe. So to pull out on the day of the final purse bids is very disappointing, but this is boxing. We want Povetkin for the vacant title or Carlos Takam. Let's go." So that is Joyce's manager, Sam Jones. And with Alexander Povetkin just coming off a somewhat random fight with Hughie Fury on a Matchroom card, he has been talking about a potential fight, called out Tyson Fury. Why not Joyce? And a lot of people might say, well, Joyce, what does he really offer him? But we've just come through a situation where what was really on the line for Hughie Fury? That seemed like a very curious fight to me. And if you actually look at recent form, Joyce has some recent form. He just come off a win against Bryant Jennings, and obviously a couple of other decent-ish wins against former top contenders or a former heavyweight champion in Berman Stavern, although at that point Stavern was a husk of a husk. But the Jennings fight, that was a very good win in the best of Joyce's career to date. He's about 10-0 at the moment. He's looking for big fights. He's looking for opportunities, exposure, and this one here with Alexander Povetkin, it could well fit the bill. It would be a much high-profile fight compared to the Hughie Fury one, which, to be fair, had very little build-up in terms of hype or buzz, although it had, hardcore heavyweight boxing fans intrigued. But this one here, Povetkin and Joyce, if you were to make that even just for the EBU title, I think BT Sport, because obviously he's with Frank Warren, that could actually be a pay-per-view event in its own right. And I know not everyone would be happy with that, but I think it is that sort of standard of fight where it would deserve to be on that sort of, it's there or thereabouts in terms of a pay-per-view event if you stack the undercard as well. And with Alexander Povetkin actively looking for a good fight, and he didn't take too much damage in that fight with Hughie Fury, this could actually double as a decent event, and it would give Povetkin another opportunity to come to the UK and fight. He does seem to like fighting in the United Kingdom. He's fought there, 2-3 times already? So I actually like this for a number of reasons. I think it would work up well for Joyce, but also Povetkin. He doesn't seem to be too fussed with some of the opponents if, he's taking on Hughie Fury, for example, but also it would be a big-time exposure for Povetkin. But obviously a lot on the line for Joyce, and it is one of those sort of challenges where Joe Joyce is coming up in the division. He's still got something to prove to get to that next level, that next step, prove that he belongs among the sort of top heavyweights in the division. He's on his way, sort of working his way through the levels, but Povetkin represents probably a step up again from Bryant Jennings. And we have seen that Alexander Povetkin, obviously he is now 40 years old. He's just had his birthday in the last day or so. He is obviously on the decline from where he was a few years ago. You know, his prime Povetkin, sort of the end of that was sort of 2014, 2015. I think since then he has slowly been on a downward trajectory. Still a very good fighter, and still a fight that offers a heavyweight in Joe Joyce a lot of credit for beating him, because even though we can sort of see that Povetkin's not what he once was, he's still a very good contender, a top 10 heavyweight within the division. I think, I would be not willing to drop him out of that sort of conversation of the top 10 until he actually loses the fight. And he did sort of old man his way to victory against Hughie Fury. He was very tactically savvy in that fight, and he didn't allow Hughie Fury really to get into it. But some of that you could also say was Fury just couldn't get into it himself, didn't let his hands go enough. But who would win that fight? It's an interesting question, because obviously we saw a little bit of vulnerability from Joe Joyce in that fight with Bryant Jennings. Hurt early on to the body, and that could really be a sort of blueprint for fighters going forward if they're watching tape from that Jennings fight, of really working Joyce to the body. But obviously Joyce is a guy who, like Povetkin, a pressure fighter, comes forward, lets his hands go. I think it would be an entertaining fight for as long as it lasts. And I think fans would be split on this. Sure, Joe Joyce is seen by a number of fans as maybe being a little bit slow on the punch, and maybe a little bit robotic, sometimes upright, but he keeps coming. For a heavyweight, he's got a really good engine, and he just keeps throwing punch after punch after punch. And not everything is with a massive amount of snap, but they're hard clubbing punches, and that sort of stuff does take its toll. There is no doubt here that Joe Joyce would be letting his hands go, and it would be a very entertaining fight with Alexander Povetkin. And Povetkin similarly would be looking to sort of slip punches, land the left hook, the overhand right. He would really look to lay it on Joe Joyce, and I'm sure he would be targeting that body as well. So from the standpoint of a fight, I like that matchup. I think it's a very good matchup. And I guess similarly, Carlos Takam, who's sort of a tier below Alexander Povetkin, that would still be a very good fight. And with Carlos Takam's sort of being in a similar situation to Alexander Povetkin, they have their promoters, but not necessarily tied down to one of these other big sort of silos that are now operating. Alexander Povetkin works with Matchroom, but he's not tied to a contract with Matchroom. And Carlos Takam is the same. He's now working with Star Boxing, and obviously he'll go where the money talks. And I think for Povetkin, that could be a similar case. Although I can't imagine he would have got a pile of money for that Hughie Fury fight, but a fight with Joe Joyce on a BT pay-per-view, that could be quite a lucrative event. And I'm sure there would be quite a bit of interest in that fight, and not just among hardcore fans. I think you'd need to stack it with a few names on the undercard to really sort of fill it out, but I think it could work. But the Carlos Takam fight, maybe for Joyce, if they can't get Povetkin, Carlos Takam is kind of that next best step. I sort of see him and Bryant Jennings sort of being there or thereabouts in terms of their level. I mean, even Jennings, maybe he is still a step above where Carlos Takam is, half a step, because I think Carlos Takam, he has been obviously the last couple of years, I think he has been slowing down, and he is certainly past his prime. But that doesn't mean he wouldn't give Joe Joyce a good fight. And we saw that fight with Derek Chisora, even though Carlos Takam got knocked out. It was an all-out slugfest with Derek Chisora before he took that couple of punches sort of later in that fight that floored him. And you might see a similar sort of fight with Joe Joyce, where it would be all action Jackson between those two fighters. But very interesting development with Kabayel dropping the belt, walking away from the purse bid, and leaving that open for Joe Joyce to potentially fight the likes of a Carlos Takam or Alexander Povetkin or someone else. You never know. Someone like a Robert Helenius could be in the conversation. But I think Joe Joyce, if he's fighting for the EBU title, they'll want to, have this probably in the UK against a pretty decent opponent. And, you wouldn't want to drop too far below the likes of a Takam, for example. But what do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.